Hello and welcome to the Spectator's COP26 Summit. I'm Fraser Nelson, editor of The Spectator. We're counting down the day to COP26, so what better time to discuss some of the key themes that are going to come up. In today's packed schedule, my colleagues Kate Andrews and Cindy Yu will be discussing everything from nuclear energy to the individual actions to contribute to tackling climate change. We'll have MPs, journalists, lords, lifestyle gurus, and of course our two sponsors for today, EDF Energy and Smart Energy. But to get started, I'm delighted to welcome our keynote speaker for today. Anybody who is trying to read up in climate change science will know of Dieter Helm. He is perhaps the world's leading authority in making sense of this all. His book, Net Zero, and his numerous writings on this frame much of people's general understanding. He's not a huge fan of COP summits, arguing that they tend not to make much difference over the years. Does he think this one is going to be any different? I'm delighted now to welcome Dieter Helm. Dieter, over to you.
Thank you very much, Fraser, and thank you very much for the invitation to kick off your very important sessions today. I want to paint a big picture because it is a big picture we have to look at. Climate change is a global problem, and much as people might get terribly excited about the emissions in particular towns and villages in bits of the United Kingdom or elsewhere, the fact is that a ton of carbon emitted anywhere is the same as a ton of carbon emitted anywhere else. What we have to do is get the global emissions down, and the same applies to sequestration, because the crucial variable, which people tend not to talk about at things like COP, is the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere. You know, the problem, getting this right, is actually quite simple and straightforward. We have a bunch of greenhouse gases, and I use the proxy of carbon, in the atmosphere. They create a blanket around the globe, and they are responsible for the greenhouse effect, which is as the energy from the sun comes in, the greenhouse effect blanket captures and holds some of that heat. So what really matters, indeed the only variable that matters, is the carbon concentration in the atmosphere. And that's the product of sequestration, the natural world soaking up carbon, and emissions by the natural world and ourselves. So this is a problem about getting that concentration down, or at least stopping it going up, by sequestration and the land in particular, and also by reducing emissions. Now, you might think that after one COP and another, you know, from the original Kyoto Protocol to the Copenhagen fiasco through to the Durban Summit, Paris, and now Glasgow, that with all that intellectual, scientific, moral, political goodwill and capital devoted to this problem, after 30 years, we'd have made some progress. But the reason I wrote my book, and the reason I'm exercised about whether COP is really well focused, is that we haven't made any progress at all in preventing the increase every single year since 1990 of 2 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere. Every single year, not a dent in that increase, 2 parts per million plus every year, to the point where about 150% of the pre-industrial revolution levels. And, you know, remarkably, we added 2 parts per million last year, despite all the lockdowns around the world because of the coronavirus. We added 2 parts per million when the great financial crisis hit in 2007, 2008. So the question is, what are we doing about that? Now, here in the UK, we pride ourselves, or rather the Prime Minister prides himself, on the idea that we're world leaders in reducing carbon emissions. Doesn't say we're world leaders in making impact on the carbon concentration in the atmosphere, because that's a very different story. And if you look at what's happened in the UK economy, we've deindustrialized. We're 80% services. We import a great deal. And if you go down that process of closing down your industrial production, your energy intensive production, and import it from places like China, well, the result is going to be that you may well reduce your own emissions and look extremely good. and be able to boast to all the participants at Glasgow what a great success we are. But you may actually be increasing climate change, because a ton of steel produced in Port Talbot probably has less carbon content than a ton of steel produced in China and imported back into the UK. So if you look at the big picture, what's really been going on is the enormous growth of emissions from China, which is now nearly 30% of the world's emissions, and the apparent reduction of emissions in Europe and the UK, and to an extent in the United States. And the balance of that and the trade that goes with that produces this outcome that we add 2 parts per million per annum every single year. And when you trace this through, this has an implication about how we describe climate change and what we as individuals should be doing. So if we unilaterally, as one small country in the world, decide that we unilaterally are going to stop causing climate change, we have to make sure that our carbon footprint is going down and not simply our territorial carbon production, which is what the targets for COPs, etc., are all about. And that means that we must treat imports of beef from the cleared Amazon, imports of Chinese steel, of cement, petrochemicals, fertilizers, and so on. We must treat them in exactly the same way as we treat home production. They should all pay implicitly or explicitly the price of the emissions that go into their production. And then you get a very different story. Because if we genuinely want to say we are no longer causing climate change, it's not true when we get to net zero that that will hold, despite what the Climate Change Committee claimed, despite what the Prime Minister claims. We will only unilaterally be no longer causing climate change if we are at net zero carbon production. And that comes to the crucial point about who actually causes climate change. The truth is, it's you and me. We have this habit of thinking it's all the fault of those dirty oil companies, those horrible gas companies, and worse still, those preposterously bad coal companies. It's industry that causes all this. No, industry produces the stuff for you and me. Ultimately, the economy is for us, and it's our consumption which feeds through into climate change, and it's our consumption that has to be decarbonized. So when it's put about through the kind of cakeist argument that, it isn't going to cost you anything, you don't have to change your lifestyle, no hair shirts here, any of that stuff, this is not really true. The truth is that we have to look quite hard at what that consumption is if we want to unilaterally no longer cause climate change. And in my book, I suggest the way to think about that problem is to write down your carbon diary. So start the day and just jot down the things you do and have a hazard of a guess at how much carbon's involved. I can tell you it's a lot, by the way. 80% of the world's energy is fossil fuels. Right? And that energy goes into producing virtually everything that you consume, but especially the stuff that you import. And you'll realize that if you now want to rewrite that diary in 250 with no carbon in it, or at least any carbon that's in it fully offset, that's a radical change in your lifestyle. And what that really tells you is that we are the polluters, we live beyond our environmental means, and we have to get back on a sustainable path. And then, of course, economic growth is perfectly possible because technical progress takes place, all sorts of new ideas and inventions come about. But there's no free lunch here. And that, I think, is absolutely essential when we think about all the posturing that we'll have at COP26. So I think we should measure the right thing, which is the carbon concentration in the atmosphere. And we should set targets for our carbon consumption, our true carbon footprint, if we unilaterally want to make no further contribution. And by the way, just to square it off, if we really did charge the same price of carbon on imports as domestically, that would bottom up, produce a coalition of the willing, because of course, if you're Chinese and you're exporting to the UK and you have to pay a carbon border price, you will obviously ask the question, how do I get out of it? And the answer is pretty straightforward. Have an appropriate carbon price domestically at home. and then we're on the same level playing field. So I'm in favor of a bottom-up coalition of the willing, genuinely no longer causing climate change and gradually proliferating around the world, rather than having a grandstand idea that if everybody stands up and says they're going to be net zero in 2050, this is somehow magically going to solve our problems. So that's the frame in which I look at these problems. And of course, there's an enormous amount of detailed consideration of the component parts. But let me stop at that.
Thanks very much indeed, Dieter. Now, you mentioned hair shirts there. I imagine that's a reference to the Prime Minister's preface to the government's plans to meet net zero, which they launched last week. There was quite a striking passage there, which I'd like to read out and ask your thoughts on. For years, Boris Johnson says, going green was inextricably bound with the sense that we had to sacrifice the things that we love. But this strategy shows how we can build back greener without so much as a hair shirts in sight. In other words, he says it's false to say, he's saying, that going green means sacrifice, losing the things that we love. You're saying that that's untrue, and we should confront the fact that going green will mean higher bills, in some cases very much higher bills, and a corresponding decline in living standards.
I think that the deceit in the climate change dialogue at the political level is based upon the idea that you must tell the public that they're going to be better off, and you daren't tell them that they're responsible for any of the environmental damage that's done. So think about it simply. An efficient economy is one that includes all the costs. We're not paying the costs of the carbon emissions that we're causing, or only paying some of them, and therefore we are polluting beyond any optimal or sensible level. And we have to get that down. And you just have to look at the lifestyles that people pursue and ask yourself, how compatible are they with protecting the biodiversity and the carbon position of the climate? And the answer is they're not very. So what we have to do is get back onto a sustainable growth path. And I say growth path because it doesn't mean that we have to live in teepees. I'm very much with the Prime Minister on this. But it does mean that we have to make some pretty substantial adjustments. And if you look at the bits that are going to perhaps hurt a bit, like getting gas boilers out of houses, the answer is, well, we daren't actually tell people that it's going to be, 10,000 a house and you're going to have to pay it. So we say, well, we'll make taxpayers contribute to that. But we're all taxpayers. So I just think it's naive. I think it's bad economics. And ultimately, I think it's really bad politics and bad environmentalism, because it will be found out. After all, remember what happened when we discovered a month or two ago that we had no solution to the backup of intermittency of wind. Imagine if you're on below average income and you're receiving one of those bills on your doorstep or electronically at the beginning of October, and then you're going to get another 15% in April next year. Does that sound like a free lunch?
Right, well, perhaps not. But when I talk to government ministers about this, and they say something to me off the record, they didn't say on the record, but it's still, I'd like your thoughts on it. There's a huge amount of faith, optimistic faith in Tory circles, that technology will come along and bail us out. Now they say that look at the things that are happening now. 10 years ago, nobody would have dreamt that Elon Musk's Tesla could be worth $1 billion. Nobody would have thought that the cost of generating wind power would be down at a strike price of $35 per megawatt hour. Nobody would have thought that the advance in solar, the advance in renewables would be as fast. Fast forward this process another 20 years, and we can see technology coming to make these things possible, and therefore the trade-offs that you mentioned might be regarded as old-fashioned. So what are your thoughts on that, about the speed of technological innovation and the likelihood of this innovation coming up with lowering, perhaps even eliminating the cost of net zero?
So the first thing to say is that, of course, we're going to need technologies, right? So the line that was trotted out over the last decade was, we already had all the technologies we needed. We didn't need anything new to get to 250 and so-called net zero. Okay, turns out not to be true. Turns out to be that we need quite a lot of new technologies. And the great news is they're coming. Okay, so, my university, what the bright young graduates want to do is they want to work on new technologies for addressing climate change. Great. Okay, but it doesn't follow from the fact that we're going to hopefully address quite a lot of these problems that there are no costs in the process of getting from here to there. It's both. Okay, and let me put it to you this way. If you really wanted to make the economy efficiently drive towards new technologies, you'd put in a price of carbon. That price of carbon would be whatever level is necessary to achieve the target. And if you tell me that that price would not have any impact on the standard of living, then I think you're deluded. I think it's just not true, right? So it's both. It's not technology will solve everything, but it's not technology won't make any difference. There's a balance in here. We have to get on a sustainable growth path, and it's not by magic. And if you really believed that the technology is going to solve all this lot, well, just abolish all the subsidies. Get rid of them. You don't need any subsidies if, renewables is really cheaper than other forms of generation, for example. And take the wind issue, which I am very much in favor of wind, particularly offshore wind. But, it's not true that its price is £30 a megawatt hour. That's not paying for the intermittency. If you want to know the price of wind, add back in the price of gas that you're currently paying when the wind doesn't blow. And that's why when I did the cost of energy review, I set out that you'd have to have what I call equivalent firm power auctions. And if you do that, the rating of offshore wind, nuclear, and a lot of other technologies would look quite remarkably different from the ones that are presented to us. If you don't include the intermittency costs, you don't include the networks, you don't include the wires, etc., you will get a very low number, but it's just not true.
So if renewables are intermittent, if they can't be relied upon, and you're saying in the last few weeks ago, we all confronted the fact that the wind wasn't blowing, we had a bit of an energy crisis. What about nuclear? Isn't this the great elephant in the room that people aren't talking about? So from what I gather, the nuclear industry isn't even allowed to exhibit in COP26 because the green groups are against it. And I put to you that our choice is either fossil fuels, energy crisis, or nuclear, one of those three.
I don't think there's any silver bullet to this. My guess is that we'll need all of these things, okay? And there are no pure, virtuous, carbon-free ways of generating electricity, full stop. They all have problems. So if you look at offshore wind, it's the question of the intermittency, it's the question of being low density energy forms, and it's about networks and backup and so on. We'll have new technologies like battery storage, etc., coming along, smart demand side, etc. All of those things are coming. If you look at nuclear, there are obviously issues to address. When the famous Flowers Royal Commission looked at nuclear in '76, it said there should be no new nuclear until there is a satisfactory solution to nuclear waste. Now, it's true that modern nuclear power stations don't produce as much waste as our old magnoxes. Our old magnoxes by 1990 produced more nuclear waste than the rest of the world's nuclear industry put together. But it's also a responsibility to address those questions, and it's legitimate of people to ask questions about that. And then there's the cost per unit. If you want to do nuclear, do it properly. That's what I've always argued, right? France was building 6 nuclear power stations simultaneously at one stage when it built 50 plus of these things, right? We produce one, wait another 5 years, dither, and then think, oh, we might produce another one. Well, actually, we started off by saying, let's try 3 different sorts and see which one works. That's not how you do nuclear power. So on the nuclear front, it's almost certainly part of the frame. It's got issues to address like the other technologies. But, the crucial thing with nuclear is do it properly. And it's not just an economic question. The lifespan of the waste, the term structure of these plants always involve social and political frames for them. And that's what the government has to think through in order to push this particular part as one component of the overall energy frame.
Right. So just to follow up on that, so you're saying that the French were building 5 or 6 at any one time. we move gingerly. We come up with Hinkley points, then we wait a while, we do it again. Do you think we should right now be building 3 or 4 nuclear plants, not just simply looking at Hinkley points?
I think we should either do a nuclear program or not. Okay. I think the thing about nuclear, which is different from do we add a wind farm here and add a wind farm there, is that it is a scale issue. It has all sorts of supply chain issues associated with it. It's big, enduring, and the original plan was to have 4 of these things. Remember, it's a twin reactor at Hinkley and a proposed twin reactor at Sizewell. But either do it, or if you're not going to do it, then think through the consequences. So take a country that decided not to do nuclear, which is Germany, which is about the most, in a carbon sense, polluting country in Europe. It's not green, it's very brown. So it decided it didn't want to do nuclear in order to have the Greens as part of the coalition back in 2000, and then subsequently did various U-turns until Merkel really pulled the plug on existing nuclear as well as new nuclear. It built 13 gigawatts of coal, and it has serious issues about how to back up the system. If you want to have a wind-only system, which many environmentalists do, or an overwhelmingly wind system, there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but you do have to solve the problem. What are you going to do about the intermittency, and what are you going to do about the base load? Now, curiously, nuclear plus wind does not solve the intermittency problem. That remains. And therefore, perhaps unfortunately, it's inevitable that we'll have to have renewables. We may have nuclear, but we'll also have to have a transitionary fuel. And that's where we have to get a bit more grown up about gas and about how that gets us from here to a world in which we've got other ways of handling that intermittency.
Did Britain make a mistake in not going for fracking in the way that we could have done, say, 10, 12 years ago?
No, but not for the reasons that many people think. Frankly, if you look at the geology in the UK and its sheer complexity and compare it with the geology in the Permian Basin and elsewhere in the United States, it's never going to be particularly economic. And look at the dense populations and all the practical things that are involved in accessing these kinds of sites. I just think it wasn't an economic proposition. The real question is, should you do fracking in the US, in Argentina, in parts of Russia, and in the Middle East? And that's got a cost structure that's completely different. And just remember in all of this, when we get very excited about some of this stuff, Obama presided over the greatest expansion of fossil fuels in the United States since the Second World War. In his term, we went from 7 million barrels to 11 million barrels in production. And the United States rocketed to being one of the 3 great fossil fuel companies of the world. So, yeah, I think the fracking thing here in the UK is a bit of a side issue.
Right. It's funny that you mentioned that quite a lot in your book, how since the Kyoto years, we've led to a world boom in fossil fuels rather than the road to a greener one. People will remember Obama for his, he was talking about the rising tides in his inaugural address, and yet he presides over the biggest expansion in fossil fuels in recent American history. So is this your problem with the COP process then, that the words sound very green, but the action is not? I think the Queen put it very well when she's saying that they talk, but they don't do.
Well, they talk about 250, right? And frankly, most of the world leaders who are there at COP will be dead by then, right? And they certainly will have been elected, would have been out of office, except for our authoritarians and dictators around the world. But even then, they will be dead by then. Okay, so it's very easy to sign up to something in 250, just actually as it's very easy to sign up in 235. And by the way, the 235, no new gas boilers, is an aspiration. Okay, well, that's several general elections in the future. What we want to know is how next year and in this decade, we're going to stop adding 2 parts per million per annum to the concentration of the carbon in the atmosphere. So we want to know, what are we going to do about China? What are we going to do about carbon trade and carbon imports? And within that frame, how exactly are we going to step ourselves out of the fossil fuels? So one great thing about Britain or the UK, one absolutely standout success is getting out of coal. Okay, that the Prime Minister and others can truly boast about. But of course, if you're going to get out of coal and you're not going to build the nuclear very quickly, you have to find some other way of backing it up. Hence, we're in a gas crisis, and it's about twice as bad as it is in Europe. And all those people who are not going to pay a penny for the transition to net zero are finding these remarkable bills landing on their doorstep, and wait till they see what comes in April. And that's where you will the end. You do one or two things right, like you get out of coal, but you don't think through how you practically now do the transition, which includes address the intermittency.
But your proposal is relatively clear. You would like a carbon pricing or a carbon tax, in other words. You'd like this applied to imports in a way that would significantly increase the charges we pay for much of the kits that we buy from China right now. Could you do, if you're a politician, could you really propose this? Reveal to the public how much it would cost, reveal to the public how much it would put their cost of living up by, and then expect to get elected?
So in my world, first of all, domestically, we'd apply the carbon price to agriculture, transport, heating, and energy, right? So, for example, agriculture is relatively the largest carbon polluter in Britain by a long way. 0.5% of GDP producing at least 11% of emissions. So I'd extend it across the board and I'd apply it to imports. You're absolutely right. The consequence of that would be that all of us, we the polluters, us individually, would have to face the consequence of the carbon pollution we're causing. And that would make us worse off in the short run. So if you were asking me the question, is it possible for any politician to tell the truth to the public that they're living beyond their sustainable means and they have to adjust to pay the cost of the pollution they're causing? If your answer to that question is no, it can't, they can't, then don't tell me that you're at a turning point at COP26 and you're going to save the world and this is the route to addressing climate change. What you're honestly saying is, we are not prepared as your elected representatives to tell you, because you're not prepared to vote for us, what you would have to do if you really wanted to address climate change. And that's why for all the political capital and all the rhetoric, every single year we add 2 parts per million to the carbon in the atmosphere. And we'll do that next year, I have no doubt, and I can't see how we're going to stop doing that through this decade. And, you know, if you were wanting to convert an economy from a peacetime economy to a wartime economy in the late 1930s, you had to tell the public the truth, that a massive transition of the economy in a short period was going to cost them. And by the way, and I'm not advocating this at all, if you look at the taxation rates that resulted from that, it's extraordinary. But that's because there was an existential threat. You had to fight the Battle of Britain. You had to have Spitfires up there. If you look now, there is no immediate existential threat. A bit more flooding, it's a bit warmer in summer, some people like that, and the winters are a lot milder. Nobody actually feels that the world is falling apart around them. And that's how you get this cakeism. And I regard cakeism as the most dangerous political line to take in addressing our environmental challenges that we have now. It's wrong. I would urge the Prime Minister to follow his idol Churchill and tell him a bit more about blood, sweat and tears, in the sense of tell him there are real costs to doing this, tell the public the truth, not try and hide behind the idea, oh, it's all fine, it's not going to cost you anything, you can go on flying, you can do all this stuff, no hair shirts, none of that stuff, just keep smiling, and fly from London to Newquay to discuss climate change at the G7 summit. No, that's not leadership, and that isn't going to work.
Professor Dieter Helm, thank you so much for giving us the keynote address and for discussing some of the wider issues we face at COP26 and in the climate change debate overall.